Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating, highly structured response to one of the most popular internet arguments out there. We're going to impartially map out a paper by Ryan McClain, which is written essentially like a legal brief responding to the claim that there's absolutely no evidence for God. Now, whether you totally agree with the author or side with the critics, this explainer is going to visually break down exactly how this argument is built from the ground up.
All right, let's just set the scene right away with the core conflict. We have the modern internet-era challenge from the well-known atheist Aron Ra, and we're setting that directly against the ancient backdrop of a Catholic church. The tension here is pretty obvious, right? It's this intense demand for modern proof clashing head-on with ancient faith.
And honestly, that tension leads perfectly into this exact quote from Aron Ra. "You honestly think your feelings are the evidence?" Now, what's absolutely fascinating here is that the author of our paper, Ryan McClain, completely agrees with Aron Ra's demand. He argues that beliefs should never get a free pass from rational examination. Basically, if a proposition is true, you've got to bring the receipts.
To navigate this incredibly dense theological argument, we're basically going to treat this explainer like an epistemological courtroom. We've got 6 quick steps on the docket today: the challenge of evidence, defining our ground rules, recognizing the divine, looking at patterns across world religions, diving into a specific documentary case study, and finally, weighing the alternatives.
Kicking things off with Step 1, the challenge of evidence, where we shift from debating religion to really nailing down our definitions. Moving right along to Section 2, defining the ground rules. What actually counts as proof in this courtroom?
So the absolutely crucial point here is that evidence is not just restricted to test tubes and laboratory work. Drawing directly on the Merriam-Webster Dictionary and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the author establishes that historical documents, observable actions, testimonies, and preserved patterns, they all legally and rationally count as evidence. If it helps show whether a thing is true, it belongs on the table.
Next, we have to define reason. To borrow a brilliant analogy from the author's own Angela's Explainer, which is a plain language appendix he included for kids in the source text, reason means thinking in an orderly way instead of just yelling with confidence. And let's be real, yelling with confidence is very popular on the internet, but it isn't actually useful for finding the truth. Reason is the ordered inference drawn from the evidence we've just defined.
All right, Section 3, recognizing the divine. This is where we bridge the gap from philosophy over to revelation.
The paper maps out a very specific step-by-step logical progression here. Using thinkers like Aquinas and Leibniz, the author argues that our contingent, ordered universe logically requires a necessary source. That's step 1. But reason alone doesn't actually tell you who that source is. That's where step 2, revelation, identifies the triune God. And finally, step 3 brings in the Christian claim that Christ uniquely reveals the Father. So think of it this way. Reason gets you to the castle, but revelation introduces the royal family. But how do you actually recognize that revelation when you see it? The paper makes a strong case that the Bible doesn't just rely on vague vibes. Instead, it uses these highly specific accumulated criteria. It looks for a historical setting, observable works, good fruits, obedience, and fulfilled patterns. These become the strict recognition ground rules used throughout the rest of the author's argument.
Next up, Section 4, patterns across world religions. Let's look for those structural overlaps.
Now, when we broaden the evidential field to include humanity's major traditions, it reveals this fascinating structural overlap. Using the Angel's Explainer analogy again, the author isn't claiming that all religions are the exact same casserole. They very clearly have different doctrines. But rather, each tradition brings overlapping, essential pieces to the same giant evidential picnic. Judaism preserves the covenant, Buddhism brings discipline and compassion, Taoism preserves the way. The argument here is that this massive global convergence of preserved moral and spiritual structures is, by definition, evidence that we really need to examine.
Section 5, the documentary case study. Time to apply these criteria to a public record.
Okay, this is where the paper literally dumps a mountain of receipts on the table. The author presents a documented public corpus of his own life, including his Jewish ancestry, Catholic sacramental life, and this incredibly intense ledger of ascetical practices. We're talking about 4 prolonged 40-day fasts, plus a ledger of indulgences offered not just for family, but for historical enemies and highly controversial public figures, everyone from Judas Iscariot and Adolf Hitler to Robin Williams and Carl Jung.
The paper argues that this dense, documented conjunction of history, extreme fasting, and mercy corresponds perfectly to those biblical criteria we established earlier. Basically, it forces the critic to actually do the reading rather than just dismissing it out of hand.
Finally, Section 6, weighing the alternatives. Let's cross-examine this whole argument.
To be fair, the author impartially notes that a critic might look at all this and argue, hey, it's just a coincidence, or maybe it's psychological selection bias, or just a religious obsession. But the author sets a really firm rule for the debate. The rival theory has to be able to explain the entire mountain of receipts, the ancestry, the 40-day fasts, the public archive, the historical convergences, all of it together. I mean, as the author puts it, you can't explain away a whole elephant by pointing at one toenail and just guessing it's a potato, right? The alternative has to explain the whole conjunction.
And that all anchors the author's final formal deduction. We're stacking up the definitions of evidence, the logical progression from reason to God, the independent lines of philosophical and historical evidence, and that intense documentary case study, all into one single, highly cohesive conclusion.
So the absolute crucial takeaway is this. The paper concludes that Aron Ra is completely right to ask for evidence, but he's wrong to say there isn't any. You are totally free to debate what the evidence means, or whether you think it's sufficient. But logically speaking, you cannot look at this massive, structured box of historical, philosophical, comparative, and documentary data and claim that the box is totally empty.
Which leaves us right here. As you consider this vast array of definitions, those overlapping patterns across world religions, and the intensely documented receipts we just mapped out, you really have to ask yourself this final provocative question. If the evidential box isn't empty, what exactly is the evidence pointing at?